Welcome to Legacy of Throne. Before we begin this extraordinary journey through centuries of kings, conquests, and forgotten empires, make sure you hit subscribe and turn on the bell notification so you never miss our next epic story. On this channel, we uncover the rise of dynasties, untold wars, hidden kingdoms, and the secrets that shape the world as we know it. Subscribe now, because history belongs to those who choose to remember it. In the centuries before Sweden became a great power of Europe, before its armies shook the continent, before its banners flew over cities from the Baltic coast to the plains of Germany, the land we now call Sweden was not yet an independent or unified kingdom. It existed instead as part of a fragile and deeply unequal political arrangement known as the Kalmar Union, a union of crowns that bound together Sweden, Denmark, and Norway under a single monarch. Established in the late 14th century and conceived in a spirit of mutual defense and collective strength, the Kalmar Union was intended to create a stable northern bloc capable of resisting the growing commercial dominance of the German-speaking Hanseatic League and the territorial ambitions of expanding kingdoms to the south. But rather than providing the unity its founders envisioned, the Union became instead a source of persistent conflict, resentment, and ultimately violent rupture. It would be the catalyst for Sweden's emergence as something entirely its own. The Union was formally established in the year 1397 under the remarkable Queen Margaret of Denmark, a ruler of extraordinary political talent who managed to unite three separate royal inheritances under her effective control. Margaret had governed Denmark in her own right, secured influence over Norway through dynastic connection, and maneuvered her way into authority over Sweden through a combination of diplomacy and opportunism. Her ambition was centralized rule, a strong monarchy capable of presenting a unified Scandinavian front to a competitive and sometimes threatening European world. The symbolic ceremony that formalized the arrangement took place in the Swedish city of Kalmar, a deliberate choice, since Kalmar sat on the Swedish side of the border, and its selection was meant to suggest an equality of participation that never quite existed in practice, because from the very beginning, the union was anything but balanced. Denmark was the dominant partner, wealthier, more centrally located, and more militarily capable than its northern and eastern counterparts. Danish kings governed from Copenhagen, with the concerns of Denmark naturally at the forefront of their thinking. When they turned their attention to Sweden, it was frequently to extract resources, appoint Danish officials to Swedish positions, or override the preferences of the Swedish nobility in ways that the Swedish elite found both humiliating and economically damaging. The mining regions of central Sweden particularly, the great copper and iron mines that were the economic backbone of the country chafed, especially under Danish fiscal demands. Local lords who had governed their territories with considerable autonomy under previous arrangements found themselves subordinated to a distant authority that rarely understood their needs and frequently dismissed their complaints. Throughout the 15th century, the Kalmar Union was punctuated repeatedly by tension, rebellion, and periods in which Swedish regents effectively governed the country in defiance of whichever Danish king nominally held the title of Swedish ruler. The union existed on paper, but was contested on the ground. Maintained by the reality of Danish military superiority, but never accepted as fully legitimate by a Swedish political class that increasingly felt it deserved better. One of the most celebrated figures to emerge from this era of resistance was Engelbrekt Engelbrektsson, a mine owner from the heartland of Sweden, who led a major popular uprising in 1434 against the harsh and extractive rule of King Erik of Pomerania. Engelbrekt's rebellion was remarkable for its breadth. It drew support not only from nobles but from peasants, miners, and townspeople who had grown exhausted by Danish taxation and the arbitrary behavior of foreign-appointed officials. Although Engelbrekt was assassinated just a few years after his rebellion, he became a symbol of Swedish national consciousness and the desire for genuine self-determination. His name was invoked for generations afterward, whenever Swedes needed to remind themselves that resistance to foreign domination was both possible and honorable. By the opening decades of the 16th century, these long, simmering tensions were approaching a genuine crisis point. King Christian II of Denmark, a ruler of genuine capability but deeply authoritarian instinct, was determined to end the endless cycle of Swedish defiance and establish permanent centralized control over the Union. In the year 1520, he launched a military campaign specifically designed to subdue the Swedish nobility, whose persistent resistance had made his authority over Sweden more theoretical than real. His campaign initially succeeded. Swedish opposition was overcome through a combination of force and negotiation, and Christian secured enough of the country to organize a coronation ceremony in Stockholm intended to celebrate and formalize his authority as King of Sweden. What happened next horrified all of Sweden and changed the entire direction of the country's history. In November of the year 1520, over the course of several days following his coronation celebrations, Christian II ordered the systematic arrest and public execution of nearly 100 Swedish nobles, clergy, and prominent citizens. Those gathered had come to Stockholm for what they understood to be a ceremony of reconciliation. Instead, they were seized, accused of various charges, and beheaded or hanged in the public squares of the city. The event became known almost immediately as the Stockholm Bloodbath, and the shock it sent through Swedish society cannot be overstated. Men who had been invited to celebrate became victims of state terror. Families who had negotiated in good faith found their most prominent members destroyed without due process or genuine cause. The bloodbath was not merely cruel, it was politically catastrophic for Christian. Instead of eliminating resistance, transformed moderate opponents into determined enemies and convinced previously neutral parties that Danish rule under this king was incompatible with any form of security or dignity. Out of this moment of absolute crisis, a leader emerged who would reshape everything. His name was Gustav Vasa, a young nobleman from a family with deep ties to those who had been murdered in the bloodbath. Gustav had himself been held as a political hostage in Denmark and had managed to escape. He returned to Sweden to find a country in shock and in need of direction. Beginning in the province of Dalarna, the heartland of Sweden's mining communities, where resentment toward Danish rule ran especially deep, Gustav began speaking to anyone who would listen, rallying farmers, miners, and local leaders with a message of Swedish freedom and an end to foreign domination. According to legend, he trudged through the winter snow of Dalarna on foot, speaking in village after village, rejected at first, and then gradually, powerfully embraced as the people began to understand what he was offering. That story, the long walk through Dalarna, became one of the founding myths of the Swedish nation, still commemorated every year in the Vasaloppet ski race that retraces his route. The struggle that followed is remembered as the Swedish War of Liberation. Between the years 1521 and 1523, Gustav Vasa and his growing coalition of supporters waged a determined and increasingly successful campaign against Danish forces across Sweden. He was not a military genius in the conventional sense. He was a politician, an organizer, a persuader, a man who understood how to hold coalitions together and how to use the symbolic power of his cause to keep people fighting even when the odds were daunting. He secured crucial material support from the Hanseatic city of Lübeck, whose merchants were more than willing to finance the overthrow of a Danish king who had become troublesome to their own commercial interests. German mercenaries provided the professional military backbone of his army, while Swedish volunteers provided the numbers and the local knowledge. By midsummer of the year 1523, Gustav had driven the last Danish forces from the country, and the National Assembly, the Riksdag meeting in the city of Strängnäs, elected him King of Sweden. The Kalmar Union was over. Sweden was free. But Gustav Vasa understood something that many victorious leaders failed to grasp. Winning, independence is the easy part. Building a state that can sustain independence across generations is an entirely different and far more demanding challenge. The kingdom he had inherited was financially ruined, administratively fragmented, and deeply in debt, most immediately to the city of Lübeck, whose loans had been essential to his victory. Sweden's church owned enormous wealth and operated largely independent of royal authority. The nobility exercised considerable local power that could easily become the foundation of future challenges to the crown. If Sweden was to truly be free, if the independence he had fought for was to mean something permanent, Gustav would have to build from the ground up. His most transformative decision was his embrace of the Protestant Reformation. When Martin Luther's ideas began spreading across Europe in the 1520s, challenging the authority of Rome and reshaping the relationship between church, state, and individual conscience, Gustav recognized in them something that was not merely theological, but profoundly political. The enormous wealth accumulated by the Catholic Church over centuries, its monasteries, its land, its silver and gold, could, if brought under royal control, solve his financial problems at a stroke. Beyond the money, the Reformation offered him the opportunity to place loyal, royally appointed bishops in charge of Sweden's religious institutions rather than dealing with an ecclesiastical hierarchy that reported, ultimately, to Rome rather than to Stockholm. The Protestant Reformation and Swedish state-building were, in Gustav's hands, two sides of the same coin. Beginning in the late 1520s and accelerating through the 1530s, Gustav systematically promoted Lutheranism across the kingdom. He appointed bishops who were loyal to him, commissioned Swedish-language translations of the Bible so that ordinary people could access the scriptures without priestly intermediary, and began dissolving monasteries, transferring their wealth and lands to the crown. The resistance he faced was real. Many Swedish peasants, whose entire spiritual world was organized around Catholic practice, rejected these changes as attacks on their traditions. Uprisings occurred, most notably the Daki War led by Nils Daki in the 1540s, where tens of thousands of peasants in southern Sweden rose against Gustav's religious and administrative policies. He suppressed these rebellions with a combination of force and strategic concession, understanding that the peasantry's attachment to their customs had to be managed carefully, even as the broader direction of change continued. By the time Gustav Vasa died in the year 1560, Sweden was firmly and irreversibly a Lutheran kingdom, and that religious identity would remain one of the most consistent features of Swedish national consciousness for centuries. Gustav also fundamentally reformed how Sweden was governed. He introduced new systems of taxation that gave the crown, a direct and reliable income stream. He standardized administrative procedures, established systems of record-keeping that gave the state genuine knowledge of its own resources, and replaced the semi-independent provincial autonomy that had characterized medieval Sweden with a more integrated royal administration. He was, in essence, building the institutional infrastructure that would later make Sweden capable of sustaining a European empire. Without the foundations, he laid the financial systems, the administrative networks, the religious unity. None of what came after would have been possible. The death of Gustav Vasa in the year 1560 did not signal an end to Swedish ambition. It opened a new and more complex phase in the country's development. Under Gustav's strong hand, Sweden had secured its independence, embraced Lutheranism, and built the administrative foundations of a centralized state. Now, with each new monarch who followed, fresh ambitions emerged, particularly focused on the strategic and commercially vital Baltic Sea region. The Vasa dynasty that Gustav had founded would continue to shape Swedish destiny throughout the rest of the 16th century and well into the 17th, but its path was far from smooth, marked by dynastic rivalry, religious conflict, and the kind of turbulence that comes when a young, rising power is still discovering the full extent of its strength. Gustav Vasa's chosen heir was his son Erik, who ascended the throne as King Erik XIV. Where his father had been primarily focused inward on consolidating the state he had won, Erik turned his gaze outward, drawn toward the possibilities that Sweden's emerging strength might allow it to pursue beyond its own borders. He was a man of genuine intelligence and considerable cultural refinement, corresponding with foreign courts, interested in art and music, and possessed of an international perspective that his father had not particularly cultivated. But Erik was also profoundly unstable in ways that would ultimately destroy him, prone to paranoid suspicion, capable of sudden and shocking violence, and unable to maintain the stable relationships with the Swedish nobility that effective governance required. Among Erik's first foreign policy decisions was the pressing of Sweden's claim over parts of Livonia, a region located in what is now Latvia and Estonia. Livonia had been controlled by the Livonian Order, a branch of the Teutonic Knights, for centuries. But by the mid-16th century, the order had fragmented, and its former territories had become a contested prize, attracting the ambitions of multiple powers simultaneously. Ivan the Terrible's Russia was pressing from the east. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth under King Sigismund Augustus was positioning itself to absorb the region from the south. Denmark watched from the west. And now Sweden, from the north, entered the competition. In the year 1561, Swedish forces occupied the port city of Revel, modern-day Tallinn, marking Sweden's first permanent territorial expansion beyond its traditional boundaries, and the beginning of what would become a defining Swedish strategic concept, the ambition to control the Baltic Sea itself, the Dominium Maris Baltici. The Livonian War that resulted from this competition drew Sweden into a complex multi-front conflict that tested the young kingdom's resources and revealed the fragility of Eric's political position at home. As the war dragged on and the pressures mounted, Eric's instability became increasingly visible and dangerous. In one notorious episode, in the late 1560s, he ordered the arrest of several members of the powerful Sture family, prominent nobles, whose influence he had come to fear, and then personally participated in their murder. This act of royal violence against the kingdom's most prestigious families crossed a line from which there was no return. The political elite that had tolerated Eric's eccentricities could no longer ignore his danger. In the year 1568, his own brother John led a coup that deposed Eric and took the throne as King John III. Eric was imprisoned and died under circumstances that remain disputed, most probably poisoned, ending one of the most troubled reigns in Swedish history. John III brought a different temperament to the throne, more measured and more genuinely diplomatic, though no less ambitious in matters of foreign policy. His most significant personal characteristic was his unusual religious disposition. While he maintained Lutheranism as the official faith of the Swedish state, he also harbored genuine sympathy for Catholic traditions and liturgical practices, a sympathy reinforced by his marriage to Katarina Jagiellonica, a Polish Catholic princess of considerable personal strength and political connections. This marriage drew Sweden into a closer orbit with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and had consequences that neither John nor anyone else could fully have foreseen at the time. John and Katarina's son Sigismund was raised Catholic, educated in the Polish court, and developed a primary identity as a Polish prince rather than a Swedish one. When John III died in the year 1592, Sigismund, who was already ruling as King of Poland-Lithuania, inherited the Swedish crown as well, creating a dual monarchy that linked two very different kingdoms under one ruler. On paper, this combination might have seemed powerful. In practice, it was a recipe for conflict from the very beginning. Sweden's Protestant nobility, clergy, and common people deeply distrusted a Catholic king whose primary court was in distant Catholic Poland and who brought with him the specter of Jesuit influence and potential counter-reformation. Sigismund's absences from Sweden, he rarely visited the country he nominally ruled, and his reliance on appointed regents who consistently clashed with local power centers created a political vacuum that his opponents quickly moved to fill. The man who filled that vacuum most effectively was Sigismund's own uncle, Duke Charles of Södermanland, the youngest surviving son of Gustav Vasa, a committed Lutheran, a skilled political operator, and a man who understood with perfect clarity that Sigismund's rule represented an existential threat to everything Gustav had built. Duke Charles positioned himself as the defender of Swedish Protestantism and Swedish sovereignty against a foreign-oriented, Catholic-sympathizing monarch who could not be trusted to govern in Sweden's interests. His growing power led to open confrontation with Sigismund's supporters, and the crisis came to a head when Sigismund attempted to assert his authority by landing an army in Sweden. The decisive battle at Stangebro in 1598 ended in Sigismund's defeat. He was forced to flee back to Poland, and the Swedish Riksdag formally declared that he had forfeited his right to the throne. In 1604, Duke Charles was crowned King Charles IX. This succession crisis had two consequences that would shape Swedish history for decades. First, it permanently closed Sweden's door to Catholic influence. The kingdom was now not merely Protestant by inheritance and tradition, but Protestant by deliberate, contested choice, a faith defended against a genuine alternative. This gave Swedish Lutheranism a particular intensity, a sense of identity forged in resistance that deepened its hold on the national consciousness. Second, it created a bitter and enduring dynastic rivalry with Poland. Sigismund, still ruling in Warsaw, never relinquished his claim to the Swedish throne. His descendants continued to press that claim across generations, and the resulting series of wars between Sweden and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth became one of the most persistent and costly conflicts of the early modern era. Charles IX's reign, while relatively short, was also genuinely difficult. He faced renewed military pressure from both Poland and Russia, the latter then mired in the internal chaos of Bar, as well as the always-present threat of Danish intervention from the west. The early 17th century was a period of almost continuous warfare for Sweden, testing an army and a treasury that had not yet been sufficiently developed to sustain prolonged conflict. The defeats that Swedish forces suffered against Polish cavalry, most strikingly at the Battle of Kirchholm in 1605, where a much smaller Polish force shattered a larger Swedish army with devastating cavalry charges, revealed the serious inadequacy of existing Swedish military organization. Charles recognized this, but did not live long enough to fully address it. When he died in the year 1611, he left his son and heir, Gustavus Adolphus, a kingdom under siege on multiple fronts, its finances depleted, its military demoralized, and its future genuinely uncertain. When Gustavus Adolphus ascended the Swedish throne in the year 1611, he was 17 years old, young even by the standards of an era that expected its monarchs to mature quickly. But youth did not mean inexperience. His father, Charles IX, whatever his faults, had deliberately included the prince in the work of governance and military affairs from an early age, understanding that the kingdom he would inherit would require a ruler capable of immediate, effective action rather than a long period of learning on the throne. Gustavus had already observed warfare, participated in council discussions, and developed an understanding of Sweden's strategic situation that was considerably more sophisticated than his age might have suggested. He arrived at kingship not as a boy thrust into responsibility, but as a young man who had been preparing for it consciously for years. What he found when he took full control of the kingdom was sobering. Sweden was simultaneously at war with Denmark in what was known as the Kalmar War, at war with Russia in the context of the ongoing confusion of the time of troubles, and at war with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the interminable struggle over Sigismund's claim to the Swedish throne. Any one of these conflicts would have been a serious drain on a small northern kingdom's resources. All three together, combined with the financial exhaustion left by Charles IX's reign, represented a genuine crisis that had to be addressed before any larger ambitions could be pursued. Gustavus's first years on the throne were dominated by the unglamorous but essential work of ending wars on acceptable terms and rebuilding the foundations of Swedish power. The Kalmar War with Denmark was resolved first. In the year 1613, Gustavus signed the Treaty of Nad with King Christian IV of Denmark. The terms were not flattering. Sweden had to pay substantial reparations and make certain territorial concessions, but the treaty allowed Gustavus to free up military attention and resources for other fronts. More importantly, it bought the time he desperately needed for the military and administrative reforms that were already taking shape in his thinking. The war with Russia offered more promising opportunities. The time of troubles had left Russia in a state of profound political and military disorganization that a disciplined Swedish army could exploit effectively. In the year 1617, Swedish forces captured Novgorod, one of Russia's most historically important and symbolically significant cities. The subsequent Treaty of Stelbova confirmed Sweden's gains, granting it control over Engria and Kexholm along the eastern shore of the Gulf of Finland. These acquisitions cut off Russia's direct access to the Baltic Sea, a strategic achievement of enormous significance that would not be reversed for nearly a century. Sweden now controlled the eastern Baltic coast in a way that no previous ruler had managed, and the young king's credibility was substantially enhanced. But it was the military reforms that Gustavus was simultaneously implementing the innovations that would make the Swedish army one of the most effective fighting forces in European history that represented his most lasting and transformative contribution. The defeats of the previous generation had made clear what kind of army Sweden needed to create. The old-fashioned levies and mercenary-dependent forces that had served Charles IX so inadequately had to be replaced with something fundamentally different: a standing professional army, trained to the highest standards, equipped with the best available weapons, and capable of executing complex tactical plans under the pressure of actual combat. Gustavus began with recruitment, rather than relying on the uncertain and expensive system of hiring foreign mercenaries. He established a comprehensive conscription system that distributed the responsibility for producing soldiers across the regions of Sweden and Finland. Each parish and district was assigned a quota of men, with exemptions and privileges offered in return for reliable provision of trained, equipped soldiers. This allotment system, known in Swedish as the Indelningsverket, created a steady, predictable pipeline of manpower that gave the army a permanent, reliable character rather than the improvised quality of emergency levies. Over time, it became deeply embedded in the social structure of rural Sweden, with soldiers and their families becoming recognized. Community figures tied to specific farms and districts. Training was elevated to a new standard of systematic rigor. Gustavus drilled his men relentlessly, insisting on the kind of disciplined execution under pressure that transforms individual soldiers into coordinated military units capable of performing complex maneuvers, even when the chaos and noise of actual battle makes clear thinking difficult. He standardized equipment across regiments, a seemingly mundane administrative decision, had enormous practical consequences for logistics, supply, and the ability to equip and maintain forces in the field over extended campaigns. The organizational innovations extended to the tactical level. The massive, slow-moving pike formations that had dominated European battlefields for generations were restructured by Gustavus into something far more flexible and lethal. He reduced the depth of infantry formations dramatically, spreading his men into shallower, wider lines that maximized the firepower of the growing proportion of musketeers in his armies. Pikemen remained essential. They protected the musketeers from cavalry charges, but their role was reconfigured to complement rather than dominate the tactical system. Musketeers were trained to deliver coordinated volley fire in sequence, maintaining continuous pressure on enemy formations rather than firing in chaotic individual bursts. This system required exceptional discipline, but Gustavus had trained his men to provide it. Most revolutionary of all was his transformation of artillery. The heavy bronze cannon of the period were powerful but immobile, essentially fixed siege pieces that could be deployed before a battle but could not respond to the fluid dynamics of an engagement already in progress. Gustavus commissioned the development of lighter field guns, the famous Swedish leather cannon, and later improved cast metal pieces that could be moved rapidly by horse teams and repositioned during the course of a battle. This mobile artillery gave Swedish commanders something no army had previously possessed in quite the same form: genuine fire support that could be directed where it was needed, rather than fixed in place before the first shot was fired. Combined with the coordinated use of cavalry, which Gustavus trained to charge home and fight at close quarters, rather than merely exchange pistol fire at range, these innovations created a combined arms system of infantry, cavalry, and mobile artillery that was qualitatively superior to anything its opponents could field. The partnership that enabled Gustavus to implement these military innovations while simultaneously managing the complex political and diplomatic challenges of running a kingdom at war was his relationship with Axel Oxenstierna, arguably the most capable chancellor in Swedish history and one of the great administrators of the early modern period. Where Gustavus was a man of extraordinary personal energy, military genius, and inspirational leadership, Oxenstierna was methodical, patient, and possessed of a comprehensive understanding of law, administration, and diplomatic strategy that complemented the king's more intuitive qualities perfectly. Together, they reshaped not only the Swedish army, but the entire machinery of the Swedish state, creating new government departments with clearer responsibilities, streamlining tax collection, improving the administration of justice, and generally building the institutional infrastructure that could support prolonged military operations in distant theaters. By the late 1620s, these reforms had produced results visible enough to attract the attention of observers across Europe. Sweden's army was demonstrably different from what it had been a decade before: better trained, better equipped, better organized, and led by officers of genuine professional competence. Its treasury, while not unlimited, was considerably more stable than it had been when Gustavus inherited it. Its administration was more capable and more responsive. The young king had done what he set out to do: transform a kingdom under siege into a kingdom capable of projecting power. And power was exactly what the moment demanded. While Sweden had been rebuilding itself, Europe had descended into the catastrophic conflict that history knows as the 30 Years' War. What had begun in 1618 as a rebellion by Protestant nobles in Bohemia against their Habsburg emperor had escalated into a continent-wide struggle involving virtually every major power religious in its origins, but increasingly geopolitical in its character, driven as much by questions of power and territory as by questions of faith. And by the late 1620s, the Protestant cause was in genuine crisis. Catholic League armies under generals of the caliber of Johann Circles, Count of Tilly, had achieved decisive victories across Bohemia, the Palatinate, and the northern German states. Denmark's attempt to intervene, on behalf of the Protestant cause, had ended in humiliating withdrawal. Protestant princes across Germany were divided, demoralized, and increasingly desperate for a leader capable of reversing the tide. Into this vacuum, Gustavus Adolphus prepared to step not simply as a religious ally, motivated by shared faith, but as a strategic actor who understood with clear-eyed pragmatism that a Europe dominated by Habsburg Catholic absolutism would leave Sweden isolated, surrounded by hostile powers, and permanently constrained in its capacity to develop and sustain its position as a major state. The intervention in Germany was both a crusade and a calculated act of power politics, and Gustavus was honest enough with himself and with those around him to understand both dimensions simultaneously. When Gustavus Adolphus landed on the northern coast of Germany in the summer of the year 1630, he brought with him something that the Protestant cause had been desperately lacking for years: a disciplined, professional army led by a commander of genuine genius who had a coherent strategic vision for what needed to be accomplished. The landing was not simply a military event. It was a declaration that the balance of the 30 Years' War was about to change, that the apparently inexorable advance of Habsburg power in Germany had encountered something it could not simply overwhelm by the superior weight of its resources and the accumulated momentum of a decade of Catholic victories. Gustavus did not immediately achieve the warm welcome he had expected from German Protestant princes, many of whom were cautious about committing to a foreign alliance and uncertain whether the Swedish king could deliver what he promised. The early months on German soil involved as much diplomatic work as military activity, reassuring anxious princes, negotiating terms of alliance, and demonstrating by his conduct and his discipline that Swedish forces would be a different kind of ally from the mercenary armies that had devastated the region for years. His strict orders against looting and his genuine efforts to maintain order in territories that came under his protection earned him a reputation that proved enormously valuable in winning the trust of communities that had been traumatized by a decade of destructive warfare. The decisive moment that transformed the war's character came at the Battle of Breitenfeld in Saxony in September of the year 1631. Here Gustavus faced the veteran army of Count Tilly, the general who had been the most effective military instrument of the Catholic League throughout the war's first decade, a man whose forces had laid waste to Bohemia, crushed the Palatinate, and most recently destroyed the city of Magdeburg in one of the war's most notorious acts of violence. At Breitenfeld, Gustavus deployed the combined arms system he had developed and refined over years of Swedish warfare mobile artillery, creating gaps in enemy formations, disciplined infantry exploiting those gaps with coordinated fire and advancing movement, cavalry sweeping around flanks rather than simply exchanging shots at range. The battle was not simply a Swedish victory, it was a demonstration. Before the eyes of every military observer in Europe, Gustavus showed that the tactical innovations he had developed were not theoretical constructs, but genuine, battlefield realities capable of defeating the most experienced and well-reputed forces on the continent. Tilly's army, which had seemed invincible for years, was shattered. The Protestant states of Germany watched in astonishment and relief, and the political consequences of the victory spread far beyond the battlefield itself. Within weeks, princes who had been cautiously neutral began aligning with Sweden. Cities that had submitted to Habsburg authority began reconsidering their positions. The war that had seemed to be approaching a Catholic conclusion was suddenly wide open again. Gustavus moved with characteristic speed to exploit his advantage. Swedish forces swept through Thuringia and Franconia, capturing towns and strategic positions, installing Swedish-aligned garrisons, and extending the territory under Protestant and Swedish control at a pace that alarmed the imperial court in Vienna. Emperor Ferdinand II faced the reality that the man he had assumed could be managed a northern king who might provide temporary disruption before being bought off or worn down was instead conducting a systematic campaign that threatened the Habsburg position across all of central Germany. The emperor's response was to recall the most controversial and feared general in his service, Albrecht von Wallenstein. Wallenstein had previously commanded imperial forces with genuine effectiveness before being dismissed due to political rivalries and concerns among the princes of the empire about his growing independent power. Now, with Sweden's armies advancing unchecked, Ferdinand had no choice but to restore him, accepting whatever conditions Wallenstein demanded in order to obtain his services. Wallenstein raised a new imperial army with remarkable speed and established a fortified position near Nuremberg, aiming to halt the Swedish advance and create the conditions for a decisive confrontation. In the summer of 1632, the two great armies came face to face in a prolonged confrontation around Nuremberg that tested both commanders' patience and their armies' endurance. Gustavus attempted to force a decisive engagement, but Wallenstein refused to be drawn out of his fortified position onto terms favorable to the Swedes. The siege and countersiege that followed, in conditions of increasing supply difficulty, ultimately forced Gustavus to withdraw northward. It was the first significant check to his progress, not a defeat, but a reminder that Wallenstein was a strategist capable of frustrating even Gustavus Adolphus's genius for decisive action. The war's climax came at the Battle of Lutzen in November of the year 1632, one of the most significant and tragic engagements in all of Swedish history. The battle was fought in conditions of thick morning fog that obscured formations, disrupted timing, and created the confusion that makes close-quarters combat more terrifying and more costly than any tactical plan accounts for. Gustavus led from the front, as was his custom, believing that the personal presence of the commander at the critical point of an engagement inspired men to efforts they would not achieve under distant direction alone. He had been separated from his main bodyguard during the chaotic fighting when he was shot. Accounts vary on the exact circumstances, but the physical reality was devastating: multiple gunshot wounds and a sword thrust that left him unable to survive. He was 37 years old. The Swedish army, despite the death of its king, won the battle. Wallenstein's forces withdrew. The Protestant cause held, but the cost was almost beyond reckoning. Gustavus Adolphus had been not merely Sweden's military commander, but its moral center. The embodiment of everything the war was supposed to be about: the defense of Protestant freedom against Catholic absolutism, the assertion of a new kind of organized and disciplined military power, the vision of a Northern European great power capable of reshaping the continent's political landscape. His death sent shockwaves through every Protestant court in Europe. Friends wept and enemies gave thanks. Even those who had found him ambitious to the point of threatening their own interests recognized that something irreplaceable had been lost. The Sweden he left behind was in a genuinely precarious position. His daughter and heir Christina was only 6 years old, far too young to govern, and the kingdom's entire strategic position in Germany depended on continued military momentum and the maintenance of alliances that had been built largely on Gustavus's personal credibility and military success. The Regency Council that governed she had opinions on foreign policy, on administration, on the conduct of the negotiations that were moving toward the Peace of Westphalia, and she expressed them with confidence. At the same time, from the very beginning of her active reign, certain features of Christina's character created friction with the expectations and values of the Swedish political and religious establishment. She was clearly reluctant to marry, and in a 17th-century monarchy where the entire concept of dynastic continuity depended on the ruler producing legitimate heirs, this reluctance was not merely a personal eccentricity, but a political problem of the first order. The Swedish nobility pressed her repeatedly on the marriage question. She deflected, delayed, and eventually made it clear that she was not going to marry. Her relationship with gender conventions more broadly was unconventional. She preferred masculine clothing. She hunted and rode with men. She displayed none of the carefully modulated, feminine persona that political culture expected of female rulers. She was clearly her father's daughter in her intellectual intensity and physical energy, but she was something else too, something that didn't fit the categories her world had available for women with power. Her court became one of the most intellectually vibrant in Europe. She was a serious patron of the arts and sciences, spending lavishly on books, paintings, sculptures, and the salaries of foreign scholars she invited to Stockholm. The philosopher René Descartes came to her court in late 1649, reportedly at Christina's personal invitation after a sustained philosophical correspondence. The story of Descartes in Stockholm is one of those episodes that seems almost too symbolic to be accidental. One of the greatest minds of the age, accustomed to the relatively mild winters of the Netherlands, arriving in the harsh Swedish cold, and then attending on the Queen's intellectual demands at 5 in the morning because that was when her schedule permitted. He died in February 1650, after only a few months, from respiratory illness. Whether the climate or the schedule killed him first is debated, but the episode illustrated both the genuine seriousness of Christina's intellectual interests and the costs that serious intellectual life could impose on those who came within her orbit. As the 1650s began, Christina's behavior became increasingly difficult to reconcile with the expectations of those around her. She was engaging in what appeared to be deliberate and systematic generosity toward the nobility, distributing crown lands and revenues in quantities that alarmed the treasury and raised questions about her fiscal judgment. She was making increasingly clear her dissatisfaction with the constraints of rule, her impatience with the daily obligations of governance, and her growing sense that the life she was living in Stockholm was not the life she wanted. And beneath all of this, she was undergoing private religious transformation whose full dimensions she was not yet ready to disclose publicly. Christina had become drawn to Catholicism. The precise trajectory of this conversion remains a matter of historical debate, whether it was primarily intellectual, spiritual, emotional, or some combination of all three, but the fact of it was becoming impossible to conceal from herself or from those closest to her. In the strictly Lutheran Sweden of the mid-17th century, where the Protestant Reformation was not a historical memory, but a living identity forged in the blood of decades of war, the idea of the reigning monarch converting to Rome was literally politically impossible. The law of the land made Catholicism illegal. The entire identity of the Swedish state was bound up with Lutheranism in a way that was both genuinely sincere and deeply practical. Christina could not be both Queen of Sweden and a Catholic. The two identities were mutually exclusive. The decision to abdicate once she had reached, it was implemented with the deliberate theatrical flair that characterized so many of her actions. In a carefully staged ceremony at Uppsala in June of the year 1654, surrounded by the court, the nobility, and the officials of the Swedish state, Christina removed the symbols of monarchy from her own body, the crown, the scepter, the orb, the royal cloak piece by piece, each removal a symbolic statement that she was relinquishing this role voluntarily, permanently. Only the sword she declined to remove herself, reportedly stating that it was not suitable for someone else to remove it from her. She had chosen, as her successor, her cousin Carl Gustav of the Palatinate Zweibrücken, a solid military man whose Protestant credentials were impeccable and whose dynastic relationship to the Vasa line gave him a plausible claim. He was crowned as King Charles X Gustav, the beginning of a new royal house, the Palatinate Zweibrücken dynasty, after the Vasa line was effectively ended on the throne. Christina left Sweden almost immediately and never returned permanently. She traveled through Europe, eventually reaching Rome, where she publicly converted to Catholicism and was received by the papal court with the kind of celebration that made her conversion a major political and cultural event across the continent. For the papacy, the spectacle of the Queen of one of Europe's leading Protestant powers embracing Rome was a propaganda triumph. For Protestant Europe, it was somewhere between a scandal and a betrayal. The daughter of the champion of Protestantism, the child of the king who had died at Lutzen defending the Protestant cause, had gone over to Rome. Christina spent the remaining decades of her life in Rome as a prominent cultural patron, intellectual figure, and occasional political intriguer, living in the Palazzo Riario, maintaining a court of scholars and artists, and continuing to play a visible role in European cultural life. She was extraordinary to the end, one of the most genuinely unusual figures of the entire early modern era. When Charles X Gustav ascended the Swedish throne in the year 1654, he inherited an empire that was vast, powerful, and positioned at the center of European diplomatic life, but also one that was balanced on a knife's edge. The preceding years of Queen Christina's reign had been marked by extraordinary cultural achievement and genuine intellectual distinction, but also by a systematic weakening of royal finances through excessive land grants to the nobility, and a foreign policy that had been more concerned with maintaining Sweden's post-Westphalia prestige than with addressing the structural challenges of sustaining a far-flung imperial system over the long term. Charles was a very different kind of ruler from his predecessor, where Christina had been an intellectual who was uncomfortable with the obligations of governance. Charles was a soldier king, shaped, entirely by military experience and focused with single-minded intensity on maintaining and, if possible, extending Sweden's position as the dominant power of Northern Europe. He wasted almost no time. Within months of his coronation, Charles had identified his target and begun preparations for the war that would define his reign. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the ancient rival that had been contesting Swedish interests since the days of Sigismund's dynastic claims, was experiencing a period of profound internal weakness. Years of war with Russia and with Ukrainian Cossack forces had devastated large portions of its territory, depleted its resources, and exposed the structural fragilities of its unusual constitutional system, in which the liberum veto gave any single member of the Polish parliament the power to dissolve the assembly and nullify all its decisions. Charles recognized opportunity when he saw it, and in the summer of 1655 he launched the invasion that Polish history remembers as the deluge, one of the most devastating military campaigns in that country's long and often tragic experience of foreign invasion. The speed and completeness of the initial Swedish success was breathtaking. Polish defenses crumbled with a rapidity that shocked even Charles himself. Within weeks, Swedish forces had captured Warsaw and Krakow, the two most symbolically important cities in the Commonwealth. Polish noble families that lacked the will or the resources to resist submitted and offered their allegiance to the Swedish king. In regions where Swedish forces appeared, local leaders frequently accepted Swedish authority rather than face the destruction that continued resistance would bring. It appeared for a brief and intoxicating moment as though Charles might achieve in Poland what Gustavus Adolphus had achieved in Germany, a decisive, rapid military success that would reshape the regional balance of power in Sweden's favor at acceptable cost. The appearance was deceptive. Poland was not Germany. The Commonwealth had a depth of national and religious identity reinforced by the intense Catholicism of the Polish population and the powerful mythology of the Polish nation as the bulwark of Christendom against Eastern barbarism that was not extinguished by military defeat. As Swedish forces spread across the country and Swedish occupation began to feel like permanent domination rather than temporary military presence, resistance organized, rapidly and effectively. The military leader who became the symbol of this resistance was Stefan Czarnecki, a commander of genuine talent and extraordinary energy who mastered the art of irregular warfare, attacking Swedish supply lines, ambushing isolated detachments, coordinating local uprisings, and denying the Swedish army the kind of definitive submission that would have allowed it to consolidate its conquests and govern effectively. The reversal of fortunes that followed the initial Swedish successes was dramatic. Within a year of the invasion, the military and political situation had transformed from a Swedish triumph into a grinding attritional conflict in which Sweden's advantages in battlefield tactics and professional military organization were increasingly offset by the difficulty of governing and holding a territory as large and as resistant as the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And as Sweden's difficulties in Poland became apparent, other powers began to see opportunities in Sweden's overextension. The most consequential of these opportunistic interventions came from Denmark. King Frederick III of Denmark had watched Sweden's Baltic dominance with the frustrated resentment that came from remembering all that Denmark had lost in previous conflicts, the southern Scandinavian provinces that had once been Danish and were now Swedish, the influence over Scandinavian affairs that Copenhagen had exercised for a century and a half before Gustav Vasa's revolution. In the summer of 1657, with Swedish forces committed in Poland and seemingly vulnerable, Denmark declared war on Sweden and invaded Holstein, a decision that would turn out to be one of the most spectacular strategic miscalculations in Danish history. Charles X Gustav's response was one of the boldest and most dramatic military gambits of the entire 17th century. Rather than diverting forces from the Polish theater to defend against the Danish threat in the conventional manner, He marched his army north with extraordinary speed, led it across the frozen waters of the straits that separate the Danish peninsula from the Scandinavian mainland, including the Great Belt and the Little Belt, normally uncrossable barriers that Denmark had always regarded as its natural protection, and appeared in front of Copenhagen before the Danes had any reasonable expectation of Swedish forces being anywhere near their capital. The ice crossing was not merely a tactical set maneuver. It was a statement about the character of the Swedish army and the quality of its leadership, that this was a force capable of doing what other armies would consider physically impossible. Denmark, confronted with a Swedish army outside Copenhagen and the realistic prospect of losing everything in a single catastrophic campaign, negotiated. The Treaty of Roskilde, signed in February of 1658, was a triumph beyond anything Charles might realistically have hoped for when he launched his campaign the previous year. Denmark was forced to cede the provinces of Scania, Halland, and Blekinge territories that had been Danish for centuries, and that gave Sweden control over both shores of the Øresund, the narrow strait through which the vast majority of Baltic trade passed. Sweden also gained Trondheim in Norway and the island of Bornholm. These acquisitions fundamentally and permanently altered the Scandinavian balance of power. Denmark would never again be the dominant power in the region. Yet Charles, having achieved a stunning diplomatic victory, made the strategic error of not stopping. In the same year, he reopened hostilities against Denmark, seeking to exploit the country's weakness further rather than consolidating his extraordinary gains. This decision proved far more difficult than he anticipated. Danish resistance stiffened considerably as the population rallied to defend against what now felt like attempted annihilation rather than territorial adjustment. Critically, other European powers began to intervene. The Dutch Republic and England both sent naval forces to the Baltic to prevent Sweden from achieving complete control of the Øresund, whose tolls provided a crucial revenue source for Baltic and international trade. A Sweden that controlled both shores of the strait with no rivals was a Sweden with an effective monopoly over the most important commercial waterway in northern Europe, and neither the Dutch nor the English were willing to accept that outcome. The involvement of these Western naval powers complicated the military situation sufficiently that Charles was unable to deliver the knockout blow he sought against Denmark. And as his Danish campaign stalled, the situation in Poland deteriorated further, while Russia, which had its own territorial ambitions in the Baltic region, entered the war as well, declaring against Sweden and advancing into Livonia. By the late 1650s, Sweden found itself fighting on multiple fronts, simultaneously, against a coalition of enemies whose combined resources and determination were beginning to exceed what Swedish military excellence could overcome through tactical superiority alone. The war was still unresolved when Charles X Gustav died suddenly in Gothenburg in the year 1660 at the age of 37, unexpectedly, leaving behind a 5-year-old son as his heir and a kingdom committed to multiple simultaneous conflicts without the leadership that had made those commitments manageable. His death removed the driving strategic vision that had sustained the aggressive posture, and without it, the momentum quickly dissipated. The peace negotiations that followed moved swiftly. The Treaty of Oliva, signed in May of 1660 near Danzig, ended the war between Sweden and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It confirmed Sweden's possession of Livonia and, critically, secured the formal renunciation by Poland of all dynastic claims to the Swedish throne, finally ending the long Sigismund dispute that had been a source of conflict and instability for more than 60 years. The Treaty of Copenhagen, signed in the same year, confirmed the major Scandinavian territorial adjustments of Roskilde while returning Trondheim and Bornholm to Danish control. The southern provinces Scania, Halland, Blekinge remained Swedish. These treaties marked the high-water mark of Swedish territorial expansion. The empire was at its largest extent, and Sweden was unquestionably the dominant power in the Baltic region. But the death of Charles X Gustav had demonstrated something important and somewhat ominous, that the empire's continued existence at this level of ambition and reach depended critically on having at the top of the political system a ruler of extraordinary energy and military genius. When that kind of leadership was present, Sweden could achieve things that seemed almost impossible given its relatively small population and limited domestic resources. When it was absent, as it now was, with a child on the throne, and a regency council dominated by aristocratic factions, the vulnerabilities of an overextended empire became very quickly apparent. The death of Charles, the 10th Gustav, in the year 1660 plunged Sweden into a regency that would last for over a decade, governed in the name of the young Charles XI by a council of senior nobles whose priorities were far more by the interests of their own class than by any coherent vision of what the empire needed to sustain itself through the challenges ahead. The Regency era was not a period of complete dysfunction. Sweden remained at peace for most of it. The administration continued to function, and the territories acquired in the previous decades were maintained, but it was a period in which the structural weaknesses of the imperial system were allowed to accumulate rather than being addressed, and in which the power of the aristocracy grew at the expense of both the crown and the broader Swedish population in ways that created the conditions for the dramatic confrontation that would come when the young king finally took full authority into his own hands. The council that governed in Charles XI's name was dominated by a small number of extraordinarily wealthy and powerful noble families. The most prominent figure was Magnus Gabriel de la Gardie, a man of genuine cultural body, sophistication, and diplomatic experience, who was also a near-perfect embodiment of the contradictions of the era. He had been a close personal friend of Queen Christina and had benefited enormously from her generosity with crown lands during her reign. His personal wealth was staggering, his lifestyle lavish in a way that made him a symbol of aristocratic excess rather than aristocratic service, and his governance of the Regency Council reflected his class's interest in preserving its own privileges rather than strengthening the state's capacity to defend its imperial position. Under his effective leadership, the council managed the empire in a caretaker fashion, avoiding major initiatives, handling crises as they arose, and ensuring that the tax burdens that sustained the military fell primarily on peasants and townspeople rather than on the nobility whose lands were largely exempt from the most significant levies. The fiscal consequences were serious. The crown's direct revenues, already diminished by decades of generous land grants to the nobility, continued to decline as the Regency proved no more willing than its predecessors to address the underlying structural problem. Too much of Sweden's productive agricultural land had been transferred from crown ownership to private noble ownership, depriving the state of revenues that it could not reliably replace through taxation of those who had less ability to resist fiscal demands. Meanwhile, the cost of maintaining the empire's military establishments, the garrisons in Germany, the fortresses on the eastern Baltic coast, the naval facilities at Karlskrona and elsewhere, continued to consume resources at a rate that the weakened crown revenues could not comfortably sustain. Political tensions also simmered in the recently acquired provinces. Scania, Halland, and Blekinge, transferred from Denmark to Sweden by the Treaty of Roskilde, remained culturally and administratively Danish in character. The Swedish government's efforts to integrate them, replacing Danish administrative practices with Swedish ones, imposing Swedish law, promoting Swedish language and Lutheranism in its Swedish rather than Danish form, generated resentment that occasionally boiled over into active resistance. The Snaffenor movement bands of local fighters, sometimes supported by Danish interests across the Öresund, who waged guerrilla-style resistance against Swedish authority, reminded Stockholm that territorial acquisition was one thing and genuine integration quite another. Managing this resistance absorbed military resources and administrative attention that the empire could have used elsewhere. Charles XI came of age in the early 1670s and gradually began to assert himself against the nobles who had governed in his name for more than a decade. He was not, at first glance, a particularly prepossessing figure, quiet, methodical, and lacking the dramatic charisma that had characterized his father and his grandfather. But these surface qualities were deceptive. Behind the understated exterior was a mind of considerable precision and a will of extraordinary determination. He had watched the Regency Council govern the kingdom, and he had concluded, with the clarity that comes from seeing a system's failures from the inside, that Sweden could not continue on its current path. The nobility's dominance was not merely an insult to royal dignity. It was a structural threat to the empire's survival. The war that forced Charles to demonstrate his capacities before he was fully ready for them came in. The year 1675, when Sweden was drawn into the broader Franco-Dutch War as France's military ally in northern Germany. The campaign that followed against Brandenburg Prussia and Denmark began badly. Swedish forces suffered a significant defeat at the Battle of Fehrbellin in June 1675 at the hands of the Brandenburg Elector, Frederick William, the Elector, in an engagement that demonstrated the gap between the reputation for invincibility that the Swedish army had carried since the days of Gustavus Adolphus and the actual current state of a force that had been neglected and poorly supplied during the Regency years. The defeat at Fehrbellin was not catastrophic in military terms, but its symbolic significance was enormous. The Swedish army had been beaten in the field by an opponent that Sweden had previously regarded as manageable. The perception of Swedish invincibility, a diplomatic and strategic asset of immeasurable value, had been damaged. Denmark seized the opportunity, presented by Swedish difficulties, to launch an invasion of Scania in 1676, supported by the Snaffenor guerrillas, who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Danish forces occupied significant portions of the province quickly, welcomed in some quarters as liberators from Swedish rule. The war in Scania that followed the Scanian War, lasting from 1676 to 1679, became the crucible in which Charles XI proved himself as both a military commander and a political leader. He took personal command of the army, imposed new standards of discipline and supply, and fought the Danes across the frozen and contested landscape of southern Sweden in a series of battles that were among the bloodiest ever fought on Scandinavian soil. The Battle of Lund in December of 1676 was the most decisive. Two roughly equal armies, Swedish and Danish, met on open ground in conditions of bitter winter cold, and the fighting that resulted was extraordinarily savage. The Danish attack initially threw the Swedish formations into disorder, and Charles himself was nearly captured in the confusion. But the Swedish army, well-drilled and deeply loyal to the king who was fighting alongside them, regrouped. Charles rallied his troops personally, led a counterattack that reversed the momentum of the battle, and by the end of the day had secured a victory that effectively settled the military contest for Scania. The subsequent Battle of Landskrona in 1677 confirmed Swedish control of the province. When the war ended with the Treaty of Fontainebleau and the subsequent Treaty of Lund in 1679, Sweden retained all its southern Scandinavian acquisitions. The Scanian War validated Charles XI in the eyes of his subjects and gave him the political standing. He needed to undertake the domestic transformation that he had been planning since he came of age. What he launched in the years immediately following the war's conclusion was a revolution in the structure of the Swedish state, not a violent revolution, but an administrative and constitutional one of sweeping comprehensiveness. At its heart was the systematic reclamation by the Crown of lands that had been granted to the nobility during the previous decades of royal weakness and aristocratic dominance. The reduction was not simply a fiscal measure, though its fiscal consequences were transformative. It was a statement about the nature of political authority, about who governed Sweden and on what basis. The enormous grants of Crown land made during the 30 Years' War, and the Regency had effectively transferred sovereign resources to private hands, creating a class of nobles whose wealth and independence gave them the capacity to resist royal direction whenever it conflicted with their interests. Charles reversed this transfer on a massive scale. By some estimates, the reduction recovered approximately a third of all land in the kingdom, returning it to royal ownership, and with it the revenues that had been flowing to private pockets rather than to the state treasury. The nobility's reaction was predictably hostile. Families that had built their social position and economic independence on lands received as royal gifts or purchased from those who received them found those foundations suddenly stripped away. Legal challenges were raised, emotional appeals were made to tradition and to the principle of inviolable property rights. Charles handled the opposition, carefully establishing formal commissions to evaluate claims, framing the reduction in terms of legal and historical restoration rather than arbitrary expropriation, and ensuring that the process appeared, at least on the surface, to be conducted according to recognized legal principles rather than pure royal will. But the direction and the outcome were never really in doubt. Charles had the political will, the popular support among non-noble Swedes who benefited from the weakening of aristocratic dominance, and the military backing to see it through. The financial transformation that resulted from the reduction was dramatic. Royal revenues increased substantially, giving the crown the resources to fund its administration and military on a sustainable basis for the first time in decades. Simultaneously, Charles launched his reform of the military allotment system, the indelningsverket expanding and systematizing the arrangement by which specific farms and districts were assigned the responsibility of supporting specific soldiers in exchange for defined tax advantages. Under this system, a network of soldier farmers spread across rural Sweden, each tied to a specific regiment and responsible for maintaining a defined level of military readiness in exchange for occupying a cottage and a plot of land assigned to their unit. The result was a standing army of considerable size that was permanently available without requiring the kind of emergency taxation and recruitment drives that had periodically destabilized Swedish finances during earlier conflicts. In the year 1680, Charles XI formally declared the Swedish monarchy absolute, a constitutional statement that concentrated legislative and executive authority in the crown, reduced the Riksdag to a consultative and ratifying role, and ended the formal political power of the aristocratic council that had governed the kingdom during the Regency. Swedish absolutism was not the French model of Versailles. It was leaner, more austere, less focused on cultural performance, and more focused on administrative effectiveness, but it was genuine in its concentration of power, and combined with the fiscal reconstruction of the reduction and the military reform of the indelningsverket, it transformed Sweden into a more efficient and more formidable state than it had been since the peak of Gustavus Adolphus's achievement. Charles XI died in the year 1697, leaving behind a transformed kingdom better administered, more fiscally stable, and equipped with the most efficient military organization in Northern Europe. His heir was his son Charles, who would become Charles XII, a young man who had been 15 years old when his father died, and who would lead Sweden through one of the most dramatic and ultimately catastrophic sequences of events in the empire's history. The Great Northern War that defined Charles XII's reign was not merely a military conflict. It was a 21-year test of everything the Swedish Empire had built across the previous century, and its outcome would determine whether Sweden could sustain its great power status in the face of a fundamentally changed geopolitical environment. Charles XII was, in many respects, the most purely military of all Swedish monarchs, a man for whom warfare was not merely one instrument of statecraft among many, but the central expression of political will and national identity. From his earliest years, he had shown an intense interest in military affairs, an almost reckless physical courage, and a cast of mind that tended to see political problems primarily in military terms. His education had been broader than this, suggests he read history widely, was genuinely interested in mathematics and natural science, and could engage on intellectual topics with real intelligence, but when political crises arose, his instinctive response was to reach for military solutions. He was 17 years old when he assumed full personal rule, and he approached the crisis that immediately confronted him with the confidence of a young man who had not yet experienced the difference between skill in military exercises and the weight of actual strategic command. The crisis took the form of a coordinated attack by three powers who had formed a secret coalition with the explicit purpose of dismantling Swedish Baltic dominance. Frederick IV of Denmark, Augustus the Strong of Poland-Saxony, and Peter the Great of Russia had each identified specific grievances and specific territorial ambitions that Swedish power frustrated. Denmark wished to recover the provinces lost at Roskilde and to reassert its traditional Scandinavian dominance. Augustus sought to capture Swedish Livonia and use it as leverage to strengthen his position in Poland, where his hold on the throne was perpetually insecure. Peter the Great had perhaps the most fundamental ambition of all: access to the Baltic Sea. Russia under Peter was undergoing the most comprehensive transformation of any state in early modern European history, modernizing its military, its administration, its culture, and its economy on Western European models with a speed and determination that was transforming a previously marginal power into something genuinely formidable. But all of this development required access to the sea, to trade routes, to naval possibilities that the Baltic could provide, and Sweden stood in the way. The three allies expected that a 15-year-old king managing a new regency situation would be vulnerable to coordinated pressure. They were immediately and spectacularly wrong about the vulnerability. though ultimately correct about the fragility that lay beneath the surface strength. Charles XII's response to the triple attack was immediate, decisive, and militarily brilliant in its early phases. His first move was against Denmark, the closest, and in some ways least formidable, of his three enemies. In the summer of 1700, working with an English-Dutch naval force that had its own reasons for wishing to prevent Swedish collapse and Danish domination of the Sound, Charles landed troops on the Danish coast near Copenhagen with a speed that Denmark had not anticipated and could not counter. Faced with Swedish forces outside its capital and lacking naval support, Denmark sued for peace within weeks. The Treaty of Travanthol forced Frederick IV to withdraw from the coalition, a first, swift elimination of one member of the Triple Alliance. Charles immediately turned east without pausing. The Russian army had besieged the fortress of Narva in Swedish Estonia, and Peter the Great's forces, estimated at somewhere between 40 and 60,000 men, depending on the source, greatly outnumbered the Swedish relief force that Charles could bring to bear. On November 20th, 1700, in the middle of a snowstorm that reduced visibility to almost nothing and gave the attacking Swedes a critical element of surprise, Charles led his army in a sudden assault on the Russian siege lines. The Battle of Narva was one of the most extraordinary military upsets in all of early modern history. The Russian forces, organized on the old Muscovite model that Peter had not yet finished reforming, dissolved in the face of the disciplined Swedish assault. Entire formations surrendered. Swedish cavalry swept through the Russian camp. When the storm of battle cleared, the Russian army had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Peter himself had left the battlefield before the assault, a decision that later embarrassed him greatly, and Charles was left in possession of the field with losses that were almost absurdly small given what he had accomplished. The victory at Narva established Charles XII as one of the military celebrities of the age. European courts buzzed with accounts of the young Swedish king who had shattered a Russian army more than 4 times the size of his own in a blinding snowstorm. But the decision that Charles made immediately after Narva would have consequences that outlasted all the glory. Rather than pursuing Peter the Great deeper into Russia, which would have been extremely difficult logistically, but might have forced a settlement before Russia could rebuild, Charles turned his attention to Poland. He had decided that Augustus the Strong was the more dangerous enemy, partly because of Augustus's remaining dynastic claim to Swedish Livonia, and partly because of the personal animosity that their conflict had generated. For the next 5 years, while Peter the Great rebuilt his army in Russia with the methodical determination that would ultimately prove decisive, Charles XII was mired in Poland. The Polish campaign achieved its nominal objectives eventually. Polish forces were defeated repeatedly in the field. Augustus was driven from his position and forced to sign the Treaty of Ultranstedt in 1706, renouncing his claim to the Polish crown and his alliance with Russia. A Swedish-aligned candidate, Stanislaw Leszczyński, was placed on the Polish throne. On paper, this was another Swedish victory in a long series. In practice, it was a strategic delay that had allowed Peter the Great the time he needed to transform the Russian military from the disorganized mass that had fled at Narva into something qualitatively different and far more dangerous. While Charles was occupied in Poland and Saxony, Russian forces had been systematically advancing into the Swedish Baltic provinces. Ingria, Livonia, Estonia, the territories that Sweden had built its eastern Baltic position around, were being captured piece by piece, their fortresses taken after sieges that demonstrated the improving quality of Russian military organization and engineering. Peter had founded St. Petersburg in 1703 on land taken from Sweden, a city whose very existence was a declaration that Russia intended to be a permanent Baltic power, regardless of what Sweden might prefer. By the time Charles turned his attention back to Russia in 1707, he was fighting to recover what had already been lost, rather than to maintain what had been secured. The Russian campaign of 1707 to 1709 began with the controlled confidence of a commander who had not yet been defeated and who had no reason to believe that his military skill would be insufficient for the challenge ahead. Charles led approximately 35,000 men east through Lithuania and into the western Russian territories, aiming ultimately at Moscow and expecting that the same combination of speed, discipline, and tactical innovation that had worked everywhere else would work here too. The early phases seemed to confirm this expectation at Holocene in July 1708. Swedish forces achieved a significant tactical success, defeating a Russian force in a complex river crossing operation. But Russian strategy had changed since Narva. Rather than offering pitched battle where Swedish tactical excellence could be decisive, Peter fell back, employing scorched earth measures that denied the advancing Swedes the food, fodder, and shelter that an army operating in the field continuously required. The winter of 1708 to 1709 was one of the harshest on record across Europe and Russia. Temperatures dropped to extremes that men who had survived Swedish winters were not prepared for. Horses, absolutely essential for the army's mobility, its cavalry operations, and its logistics, died in enormous numbers from cold, exhaustion, and lack of fodder. Men froze in their bivouacs, lost fingers and toes to frostbite, and died of respiratory illnesses that spread through the weakened and hungry army like fire. By the spring of 1709, the force that had entered Russia as one of the finest fighting armies in Europe had been reduced to perhaps 20,000 effective men, fewer than Narva had seen, operating at the end of supply lines that stretched impossibly thin across devastated territory, fighting not just the Russians, but the Russian winter itself. The alliance with Ukrainian Cossack forces under Hetman Ivan Mazepa, which Charles had been counting on to provide local support, supplies, and reinforcements, had been compromised by Russian action before it could deliver its promised benefits. Peter's forces had moved swiftly to destroy Mazeppa's capital at Baturin, killing much of the population and eliminating the supply bases that the Swedish Cossack alliance had depended upon. Mazeppa arrived with a fraction of the force he had promised, bringing supplies that were inadequate and military strength that was insufficient to change the strategic equation. By the summer of 1709, Charles had fixed his attention on the fortified city of Poltava on the Vorskla River, a position of some strategic significance that he believed could be captured and used as a base for further operations. Peter the Great recognized the importance of what was coming and concentrated his army for a decisive confrontation. He outnumbered Charles by roughly 2-1 and possessed a reformed Russian military that was now dramatically superior to the force that had collapsed at Narva. The peace settlements that followed, negotiated over several years, formalized the end of Sweden as a great European power and drew the final borders of a much smaller, less ambitious, but ultimately more sustainable Swedish state. The Treaty of Stockholm, concluded in 1720, addressed Sweden's position in northern Germany. Under its terms, Sweden ceded Bremenvärden to Hanover, the electorate, whose ruler was simultaneously King George I of Great Britain, and surrendered most of Swedish Pomerania south of the Peene River to Brandenburg, Prussia. The great elector's descendant, Frederick William I of Prussia, received this territorial expansion as confirmation that the rising Hohenzollern state would continue to benefit from Swedish weakness. Sweden retained a small portion of Pomerania north of the Peene, including Stralsund and Rügen, a residual German presence that would persist for another century before being finally surrendered, but its role as a major actor in German affairs was over. The settlement with Denmark came through the Treaty of Frederiksborg, also in 1720. Sweden paid financial reparations to Denmark and made various concessions regarding the far Swedish-Danish relationship in the Sound, the shipping tolls that Denmark collected on Baltic trade, which Sweden had competed for decades to control or eliminate. Crucially, however, Denmark confirmed the territorial arrangements of Roskilde regarding the southern Swedish provinces. Scania, Halland, and Blekinge remained Swedish. The long contest for control of the Scandinavian peninsula was resolved in Sweden's favor at the cost of accepting Danish primacy in certain maritime and commercial matters. It was a compromise that reflected the reduced circumstances of both powers after 2 decades of intermittent warfare. The most consequential settlement, the one that definitively closed the chapter of Swedish great power history, was the Treaty of Nystad, signed in September of 1721 between Sweden and Russia. Under its terms, Sweden ceded Livonia, Estonia, Ingria, and a portion of Karelia to Russia. In return, Russia evacuated those parts of Finland that its forces had occupied during the final phases of the war and paid a modest financial compensation. The exchange was profoundly asymmetric in its strategic significance. Sweden received back territory it had always held, confirming the status quo on its eastern border, while Russia received precisely the Baltic coastline access that Peter the Great had been seeking since the very beginning of his reign. The Treaty of Nystad was the foundation of a new European order in the north. It confirmed Russia as a Baltic power with genuine naval access and established St. Petersburg, that city founded on land taken from Sweden in the middle of the war as the capital of an empire that now reached the Baltic shore. Peter the Great, in accepting the title of Emperor of Russia in 1721, was signaling something about Russia's transformed self-conception. It was no longer a distant Muscovite kingdom, but a European great power, and the proof of that transformation was written in the territorial provisions of the Treaty of Nystad. For Sweden, Nystad was the formal acknowledgement of what Poltava had decided on the battlefield 12 years earlier. The empire was over. The Dominium Maris Baltici, the ambition to control the Baltic Sea that had driven Swedish foreign policy since the capture of Reval in 1561 was impossible without Livonia, Estonia, and Ingria. Without those eastern Baltic provinces, Sweden could not control the trade routes, project military power into the eastern Baltic, or maintain the strategic depth that its great power status had required. What remained was a smaller, more compact state, still sovereign, still well-administered, still possessed of the institutional inheritance of the imperial era, but no longer capable of competing with the great powers of Europe on the terms the empire's founders had established. The Sweden that emerged from the peace settlements of the early 1720s was a country that had to rebuild not only its material circumstances, but its political culture and its sense of national identity. The absolute monarchy, established by Charles XI and exercised through the wars of Charles XII, had produced extraordinary results in certain respects, military victories of stunning drama, territorial expansion on a scale that a small northern kingdom had no right to expect, but it had also produced the Poltava catastrophe and the peace settlements that followed. The political class that took control of Sweden after Charles XII's death and Ulrika Eleonora's constitutional concessions drew a clear lesson from the experience. Unchecked royal power was dangerous, and Sweden needed institutional arrangements that would prevent any future monarch from dragging the country into ruinous wars of personal ambition. The Age of Liberty that resulted negative, spanning roughly the years from 1720 to 1772, represented one of the more unusual political experiments of 18th century Europe. Sweden adopted a constitutional framework that was genuinely distinctive in its time, concentrating real legislative power in the Riksdag and reducing the monarchy to a largely ceremonial role. The Council of the Realm, the Rad, became a kind of parliamentary cabinet, responsible to the estates rather than to the king. The monarch could propose but not unilaterally decide. The estates, nobility, clergy, burghers, and peasants voted separately on legislation, and the system required sufficient cooperation among them to produce workable policy. The political life that developed within this framework quickly took on the character of organized factional competition. The two main groupings, the Hats and the Caps, were not parties in the modern sense, but they functioned as coherent political organizations with distinct programs, recognizable leadership, and the ability to mobilize support across estates. The Hats, drawing their membership primarily from the military aristocracy, and the professional classes favored a more assertive foreign policy, closer alignment with France, and a mercantilist economic approach that used state power to develop Swedish industry and commerce. The Caps, more cautious, more associated with the landed and merchant interests of the lower nobility, clergy, and burghers, favored peace, reduced military expenditure, and a more open trading economy. The factional competition between Hats and Caps gave Swedish political life a genuinely parliamentary character that was unusual in an era dominated by absolute monarchies. Newspapers and pamphlets debated policy. Public opinion became a meaningful factor in political calculations. The Riksdag's debates were often sharp and substantive, engaging with real questions about how Sweden should be governed and what kind of country it should become. Foreign powers, primarily France and Russia, recognized the importance of influencing this political competition and engaged systematically in the kind of subsidized political manipulation that was standard practice in the 18th century, funding the Hats and Caps, respectively, according to their own strategic interests. The most lasting institutional achievement of the Age of Liberty was the Freedom of the Press Act of 1766, the world's first constitutional protection of press. Freedom, drafted with significant input from Anders Chydnius, a Finnish-Swedish clergyman and remarkable early advocate of liberal economic and political ideas. Chydnius was generations ahead of his time. In many respects he had read and synthesized the emerging literature of economic liberalism that would eventually produce Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and he brought those ideas into the Swedish political debate at a moment when they could be translated into actual legislation. The Freedom of the Press Act that resulted was genuinely radical. It not only prohibited pre-publication censorship, but required the government to make its documents available to citizens who requested them, an early and remarkable expression of the principle of transparency in governance that most democracies today consider fundamental. The economic development of the Age of Liberty showed mixed results. The Hats' mercantilist policies produced some genuine industrial development, particularly in textile manufacturing and the iron industry that had long been one of Sweden's most important economic sectors, but also generated inefficiencies and the kind of cronyism that state-directed economic development tends to produce. The Swedish East India Company, founded in 1731, brought considerable profits from the Asian trade and contributed to a broader cultural and economic cosmopolitanism in Swedish cities, particularly Gothenburg, that enriched the country's commercial and intellectual life. Population grew steadily, agricultural production expanded, and the economy gradually recovered from the devastating losses of the Great Northern War era. The Hats' foreign policy adventurism was less successful. Convinced by their theory of Swedish interests and their alliance with France that Sweden could recover something of its lost eastern Baltic position, they launched the so-called Hats' War against Russia in 1741, a conflict that ended in humiliating Swedish defeat and the Treaty of Abo in 1743, which required additional territorial concessions in Finland and confirmed that Russia's dominance of the eastern Baltic was not reversible by Swedish military action. The defeat discredited the Hats temporarily, but could not dislodge them from power permanently. They continued to govern for another decade and a half, adapting their program to the new realities without fundamentally changing their orientation. The intellectual life of the Age of Liberty was one of its genuine achievements. Sweden participated fully in the European Enlightenment through the work of scientists, philosophers, and natural historians of real distinction. Anders Celsius gave the world the temperature scale that still bears his name. Carl Linnaeus developed the binomial nomenclature for classifying biological species that transformed natural history into a systematic science and is still in use today. Emanuel Swedenborg, before his turn toward mystical theology, made contributions to metallurgy, neuroscience, and what we would now call cosmology. Swedish universities expanded, libraries grew, and the educated class that consumed and debated new ideas became larger and more influential. Stockholm developed the character of a genuinely European capital, cosmopolitan, intellectually active, aware of, and engaged with the cultural currents of France, Britain, and the broader Republic of Letters. The Age of Liberty's end came through the same dynamic that had produced a crisis of governance that made strong personal leadership seem attractive to a population tired of factional paralysis and political dysfunction. By the late 1760s, the competition between hats and caps had produced a level of corruption and administrative inconsistency that undermined confidence in the parliamentary system. Foreign subsidies corrupted the political process visibly enough that even those who benefited from the system were embarrassed by it. Military preparedness had declined as factional politics prevented consistent investment. The feeling grew, particularly in military and aristocratic circles, that Sweden needed decisive leadership of a kind that the Age of Liberty's institutional arrangements made structurally impossible. The man who ended the Age of Liberty was Gustav III, the grandson of Charles XI, son of the constitutional King Adolf Frederick, and a ruler who combined genuine Enlightenment cultivation with a sharp political intelligence and a profound impatience with the limitations that parliamentary governance imposed on royal will. Gustav had been educated in the finest tradition of European Enlightenment learning. He read Voltaire, corresponded with the leading thinkers of the age, took the arts and sciences seriously, as matters of genuine personal interest, and understood himself as a philosopher king in the mold that the Enlightenment had theorized. He was also deeply ambitious, deeply theatrical in his personal style, and convinced that Sweden's decline under the Age of Liberty was fundamentally a failure of leadership that his own accession could reverse. When he came to the throne in 1771, he inherited a Riksdag that was divided, corrupt, and unable to produce coherent policy on the major questions facing the kingdom. The factional competition had become so embedded and so toxic that governance itself had suffered. In a carefully planned and largely bloodless coup d'etat in August 1772, Gustav surrounded the Riksdag with loyal troops, arrested key opposition figures, and presented the estates with a new constitution that dramatically curtailed parliamentary power and restored significant authority to the crown. The coup was swift, theatrical, and initially very popular. The political class that had been governed by the Age of Liberty system was itself weary of it, and a significant proportion of the population welcomed the prospect of decisive monarchical leadership. Gustav III's subsequent reign was one of the most culturally distinguished in Swedish history. He founded the Swedish Academy, whose prize for literature became the Nobel Prize in Literature. He established the Royal Opera and Royal Theatre in Stockholm, personally engaged in dramatic writing and theatrical production, and transformed the Swedish capital into a genuinely significant cultural center. His support for Swedish language and Swedish cultural identity was genuine and had lasting effects. The Swedish he promoted and the literary tradition he sponsored helped establish a cultural nationalism that outlasted his own reign. The Swedish Academy continues to function today, meeting weekly in Stockholm, a direct institutional legacy of Gustav III's patronage. His administrative reforms addressed some of the structural problems that had accumulated during the Age of Liberty. He reduced aristocratic privileges, opened civil service positions more widely, reformed taxation with some equity considerations, and generally attempted to govern with a combination of rational organization and personal authority that enlightened absolutism theorized as the ideal form of government. His economic policies promoted trade and some measure of commercial freedom, challenging the most rigid elements of the guild system that had restricted economic activity. The foreign policy ambitions that led him to war with Russia in 1788, the Russo-Swedish War, proved more difficult to execute than his domestic reforms. The war began, with Swedish forces making initial advances, but encountering Russian resistance that proved harder to overcome than Gustav had anticipated. More seriously, it provoked a crisis at home. The Angela conspiracy, in which a significant number of Swedish and Finnish officers, angry at what they saw as illegal war-making and resentful of the erosion of their privileges under Gustav's reforms, signed a petition to Tsar Catherine II requesting peace negotiations and effectively refusing to continue the war. The conspiracy was ultimately suppressed and its leaders punished, but it revealed that Gustav's domestic base was less solid than his coup had suggested. The aristocracy that had accepted the constitutional changes of 1772 had never fully reconciled itself to the reduction in its political role, and the war gave those grievances a military context in which they could express themselves with particular danger. The war ended in 1790 with the Treaty of Verille, which essentially confirmed the pre-war borders. Gustav proclaimed it a diplomatic victory and received some popular celebration on his return to Stockholm, but the domestic situation remained tense. His reign became more repressive in its final years. Censorship increased, surveillance of political dissidents expanded, and his relationship with the aristocracy continued to deteriorate. The combination of a constitutional framework that frustrated noble ambitions, military policies that embarrassed the officer corps, and economic reforms that threatened established interests had created a coalition of resentment within the Swedish elite that was looking for an opportunity to act. That opportunity came on the night of March 16, 1792, at a masked ball at the Royal Opera House in Stockholm. Gustav was shot in the back by Jacob Johan Ankarström, a former army officer acting on behalf of a conspiratorial group of nobles who had concluded that assassination was the only way to remove a monarch who seemed invulnerable by conventional political means. Gustav survived the initial wound, but died 13 days later from complications. He was 45 years old. His death left the throne to his young son Gustav, the fourth Adolf, governed initially by a regency. The Sweden Gustav left behind was in a genuinely ambiguous position, culturally enriched by his patronage, administratively more efficient than the Age of Liberty had managed, but politically divided and facing an international environment that was about to become dramatically more dangerous. The final chapter of the Swedish Empire's story was written not in the dramatic battles of Charles XII's era or the spectacular territorial acquisitions of Gustavus Adolphus's campaigns, but in the slow unraveling that followed the French Revolution and the Napoleonic transformation of European politics. Gustav IV Adolf, who assumed personal rule in his late teens, was a man whose rigid personality and moralizing foreign policy were dangerously ill-suited to the fluid, ruthless geopolitical environment of the Napoleonic era. Gustav's defining personal characteristic was his absolute, unwavering hostility to Napoleon Bonaparte and revolutionary France, and hostility that was not merely diplomatic calculation, but personal conviction, a genuine belief that Napoleon represented a moral evil that a self-respecting Christian monarch could not accommodate or negotiate with. In an era when the great powers of Europe were repeatedly making pragmatic adjustments to the reality of French dominance, allying, accommodating, and then reallying, as circumstances changed, Gustav IV Adolf's rigidity placed Sweden in diplomatic isolation that made its strategic situation increasingly untenable. The critical moment came when the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807 reshaped the entire European order. Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I of Russia concluded an agreement that effectively divided Europe into French and Russian spheres, with France and Russia agreeing to cooperate against Britain, the one power that continued to resist Napoleon effectively. One of the conditions of this new Franco-Russian understanding was that Russia should pressure Sweden to join the continental system. Napoleon's attempt to isolate Britain economically. Sweden controlled the Baltic Straits and could potentially disrupt British trade with the Baltic region. For Napoleon's continental system to function, Swedish cooperation was essential. Gustav IV Adolf refused emphatically on moral grounds, without the diplomatic flexibility that might have allowed him to extract concessions or delay while the situation evolved. His refusal gave Russia both a pretext for action and a genuine strategic justification for attacking Sweden's most vulnerable territory, Finland, which had been part of the Swedish kingdom for centuries and which shared a long and largely undefended land border with Russia. In February 1808, Russian forces crossed into Finland. The Finnish War that followed lasted about a year and a half and was characterized by fierce and sometimes heroic Finnish and Swedish resistance in difficult winter conditions, but ultimately by the same structural asymmetry that had decided the Great Northern War a century earlier. Russia was larger, better supplied, and operating on shorter lines than Sweden. Swedish forces won individual engagements with skill and determination, but they could not prevent the eventual Russian occupation of the entire country. Swedish attempts to open a second front through a naval landing in Russia proper came to nothing. The British alliance that Gustav had maintained through his stubborn refusal to join the continental system provided diplomatic and some material support, but could not reverse the military reality on the ground. In the summer of 1809, with Russian forces having crossed the Gulf of Bothnia and threatening Sweden proper, a palace coup ended Gustav IV Adolf's reign. Military officers, and nobles who had concluded that his stubbornness had led Sweden to catastrophe arrested him and forced his abdication. He was the last Swedish king to lose a war, a judgment that his contemporaries and successors alike felt was both accurate and relevant. His uncle was proclaimed King Charles XIII, and a new constitution was adopted simultaneously, re-establishing parliamentary authority and marking the definitive end of absolute monarchy in Sweden. The new government negotiated swiftly. The Treaty of Frederikshamn, signed in September 1809, gave Russia all of Finland along with the Åland Islands. Finland, which had been part of Sweden since the medieval era, which had contributed soldiers, sailors, administrators, and cultural figures to the Swedish state across centuries, which had been as Swedish as any part of the kingdom, was gone. Its loss was not merely territorial. It was the amputation of something that had been integral to Sweden's sense of itself, a wound that Finnish Swedes on both sides of the new border felt as personal and communal grief, as well as political loss. Russia incorporated Finland as a grand duchy under the personal rule of the Tsar, maintaining Finnish internal institutions, the Lutheran Church, Finnish law, the old Swedish administrative framework, while making it unmistakably part of the Russian Empire. The arrangement was not without benefits for Finland, which under Russian protection was spared the most destructive effects of the Napoleonic Wars that continued to ravage the rest of Europe. But for Sweden, the transformation was unambiguous. The eastern dimension of the Swedish Empire was definitively and permanently closed. The final political adjustment of this era came through the unexpected choice of a successor. Charles XIII had no children, and Sweden needed an heir. The Riksdag's decision to invite Jan-Baptiste Bernadotte, one of Napoleon's marshals, a man born in Gascony and educated in the revolutionary military tradition of France, to become Crown Prince of Sweden, was one of more improbable chapters in a story that had not been short of improbable chapters. Bernadotte accepted, converted to Lutheranism, adopted the Swedish name Karl Johan, and proved a more capable political actor than either his origins or the circumstances of his invitation might have suggested. Under his effective direction as Crown Prince, and later as King Charles XIV, Johan Sweden navigated the final years of the Napoleonic Wars with a skillful pragmatism that recovered something from the wreckage of the Gustav IV Adolf era. By joining the anti-Napoleonic coalition at the critical moment, and by demonstrating Swedish military capability in the German campaigns of 1813 and 1814, Bernadotte ensured that Sweden was on the winning side when the final reckoning came. The reward was Norway transferred from Danish to Swedish control by the Treaty of Kiel in 1814, forming the Union of Sweden and Norway that would last until 1905. Norway was not a colonial conquest in the style of the old Baltic Empire. It was a neighboring kingdom with its own institutions, its own identity, its own parliament and legal tradition, and its own aspiration to genuine independence that was only temporarily satisfied by a union that gave it internal self-government while sharing a monarch with Sweden. The union was often tense, frequently difficult, and ultimately resolved by Norway's peaceful secession in 1905. But in the immediate aftermath of the loss of Finland, the acquisition of Norway allowed Sweden to maintain its sense of Scandinavian significance and to present the end of the Baltic Empire as a reorientation rather than a simple diminishment. The Swedish Empire, that extraordinary construction that had begun with Gustav Vasa's liberation of Sweden from the Kalmar Union and reached its peak in the territorial settlements of the Peace of Westphalia, was definitively over. The empire that had shaken Europe, that had saved German Protestantism at the Battle of Bratenfeld, that had introduced military innovations still studied in the history of warfare, that had created at its height a genuinely remarkable administrative and institutional legacy. That empire had consumed itself in the Great Northern War and its aftermath, and the loss of Finland had closed the last possibility of its revival. What remained was a smaller, but in many ways more coherent country, a Sweden that had learned, through extraordinary and often terrible experience, both the possibilities and the limits of what a small northern kingdom could achieve in a world of great powers. The institutional legacy of the imperial era, the administrative systems, the military traditions, the legal frameworks, the cultural achievements shaped modern Sweden in ways that are still visible. The memory of the empire endured in Swedish national consciousness as a source of both pride and reflection, a reminder of what had been achieved and at what cost. Sweden's subsequent history, its transformation across the 19th and 20th centuries into a country known for neutrality, social democracy, and constructive internationalism, would have been unrecognizable to Gustavus Adolphus or Charles XII, but it was built on the institutional foundations that the imperial era had created, and it was shaped by the lessons about the dangers of unchecked ambition, about the costs of perpetual warfare, about the value of law and constitutional governance that the empire's rise and fall had taught. The Sweden that became a model of peaceful prosperity was, in ways both direct and paradoxical, the inheritor of the Sweden that had once made all of Europe tremble. We arrive at the end of the Swedish Empire's extraordinary arc, from Gustav Vasa's liberation in a Dalarna winter to the loss of Finland on the frozen Baltic, from the conquest of Reval to the Treaty of Nystad, from the snows of Breitenfeld to the Treaty of Nystad, from the snows of Breitenfeld, mud of Poltava. A story of resilience, genius, ambition, and ultimately, the discovery that even the most formidable of empires has its natural limit.